Hi, and thank you for tuning in to the Daily Dose for Spiritual Growth. We have been going through the life of Joseph and discovering what we can learn from the way he lived and the way he interacted with those he was closest to. Now, this past Sunday morning at Shrewsbury Assembly, Pastor Nabil preached from Genesis chapter 45. And this week, likewise, we're going to be taking that chapter apart to kind of learn from it and discover how we can apply these truths to our lives. Now, a little backstory for those of you that may just be joining us or who haven't read the previous chapters leading up to 45. Joseph has found himself in a position of power within Egypt. However, the circumstances that led up to this would have never led you to believe that this would be the case. Because 20 years earlier, his own brothers, his flesh and blood, had sold him into slavery. And from there, we read through the stories of imprisonment and all sorts of crazy things, but God. And so now in power in Egypt, who comes in need? Those very same brothers. And yet they don't recognize him. Enough time has gone by, and their grief and their despair and their hatred and their fear and their insecurities, all these things have led them to believe that what they did many years ago had resulted in death. And so they never thought that Joseph would be standing in front of them. Now, if you remember chapter 44, which we talked about in the Daily Doses last week, Judah, specifically one of Joseph's brothers, really goes to bat and shows that they have changed, that their hearts have changed by their actions, and that they're now willing to sacrifice for family, whereas before they sold family out. And so now we find the culminating chapter, Genesis 45, when Joseph literally can stand it no longer. Let's read a couple of verses today and chat about it. This is in Genesis 45, beginning in verse 1. It literally says, Joseph could stand it no longer. There were many people in the room, and he said to his attendants, "Out, all of you." So he was alone with his brothers when he told them who he was. Then he broke down and wept. He wept so loudly that the Egyptians could hear him, and word of it quickly carried to Pharaoh's palace. "I am Joseph," he said to his brothers. "Is my father still alive?" But his brothers were speechless. They were stunned to realize that Joseph was standing there in front of them. "Please come closer," he said to them. And so they came closer. And he said again, "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into slavery in Egypt. But don't be upset and don't be angry with yourselves for selling me to this place. It was God who sent me ahead of you to preserve your lives. This famine that has ravaged the land for 2 years will last 5 more years, and there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. God has sent me ahead of you to keep you and your families alive and to preserve many survivors. So it was God who sent me here, not you. And he is the one who made me an advisor to Pharaoh, the manager of his entire palace, and the governor of Egypt." This is crazy. Could you imagine being them? I mean, standing there face to face with someone, not only who you thought had already died, but whose death was literally caused by your choices and your actions. And so I can imagine the whirlwind of thoughts going through their mind where should they feel excited? Should they feel petrified? Should they feel confused? Like, what's going on? They're probably replaying all the previous conversations they'd had with Joseph when they didn't know he was Joseph, but now that they know he's Joseph, what do those conversations mean? I mean, so much going on. I love the part where it's like, he said, "Come closer." And I picture them just stunned, like, okay, like they were motionless. They didn't even know what to do. And yet for him, he had been preparing for this moment. The previous weeks, he'd been testing them, if you remember, testing them to see if they had actually changed. And now, convinced that they had from chapter 44, he can withhold no longer the truth of who he is. So many things we could unpack, but the one thing that I want to talk about from this specific portion of scripture is something that is repeated over and over and over by Joseph. He says over and over throughout this section that it was God who did this. It was God who allowed this. This was actually used to be in fulfillment of God's plan. They should have and could have assumed that he was going to come hard at them, that he was going to blame them, that he was going to chastise them for all that they had done to him. But as he discovered last week that over the 20 years they had changed, we discovered this week that over the 20 years he had changed as well. I don't know when, I don't know how, I don't know what that journey completely looked like, but over the course of those years, God had revealed to Joseph that he is in control. That no matter what circumstances may come his way, no matter what things may be done or said to him, good or bad, that God ultimately is in control. We see that evidence in this passage when he says, hey, don't blame yourselves. It was God who sent me here, not you, in verse 8. I want you just to take a little bit of time to think about that today and maybe take some moments to reflect on previous circumstances and situations that at the time maybe God was the last thing on your mind, but now looking back you can see God's hand in it. You know, sometimes we give so much power to people, and don't get me wrong, I'm not naive. I understand that we are so affected by other people's choices, other people's ideas, dictated by other people's power. I get that, but what I'm saying is this: do we trust people or do we trust God? I remember several years ago, before we were here in Shrewsbury, we were at a church, and I had such a desire to be back into full-time ministry. And I remember during some circumstances that it came to light that the leadership at the time was against women in ministry. Okay, that's a whole nother topic for another day. And I remember in that moment feeling so defeated and so discouraged. I had been hoping for several years that this would be an opportunity that would be opened up for me to work on staff at a church, and to find out that the new leadership was not even going to consider that was heart-wrenching. And I remember crying out to God and being like, God, how could this happen? Like, all my hopes are crushed, and what am I going to do now? And how are we going to, blah, all the thoughts. And literally, I remember the Lord stopping me in my tracks. And he used the person's name, this person that was in leadership that I just discovered would not be open to hiring me. I will not use their name for anonymity. However, I'll just say Jeff. His name was not Jeff. But God spoke to me and said, it's not up to Jeff what doors I opened for you. And I was like, oh, right. Maybe I'm a slower learner than you, but it was exactly what I needed to just get me out of that thought process. I was so overtaken with the power of man. But God in that moment reminded me, he opened my eyes to a different perspective that Sarah, yes, I will use people, good and bad. Whatever they choose to do, it will not thwart what I'm going to do. And so if I want to open up a position at this church or another church or a different avenue entirely, I am in control. And I remember that was an eye-opening experience. And it's caused me since then, to think about that when I find myself in situations where people do things that I'm fearful of, or do things that I feel aren't right. God is in control. God can use any and all things to fulfill the plans that he has for you and for your life. And so as you walk out in obedience with him, trusting him, he will open the doors that are right. And he also may allow people to shut doors that are not right. I didn't get hired at that church in a pastoral role, but it opened up an avenue where I actually entered into a different role, and it was exactly what God had for me. And if that initial door that I wanted had been opened, I would have missed the door that God had opened. And so I want to encourage you, no matter what you're facing today, to take some moments and say, God, I believe that you're in control. And how would that change your perspective? Hey, thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope to see you tomorrow for another Daily Dose for Spiritual Growth.